Hello everyone, welcome to Diplomatic Briefing. The United States has been waging a trade war against China for more than half a year, but recently it seems like things have gone back to square one. Even more surprisingly, it turns out that the trade war hasn't affected China's exports at all. On November 3rd, the New York Times published an article expressing amazement, asking, "What is a trade war really? It seems that China's export juggernaut is unstoppable." Is that really what the New York Times wrote? Although the Trump administration imposed high tariffs on China, causing a sharp drop in U.S. imports from China, China has, over many years, developed new markets and relied on its low-cost manufacturing advantage to successfully redirect its exports to other non-U.S. regions around the world. This has offset the decline in exports to the U.S. at an astonishing speed, and this year, China's exports are expected to hit another record high. According to data released by China's General Administration of Customs, calculated in U.S. dollars, China's exports in September, in U.S. dollar terms, export value grew by 8.3% year-on-year, and imports increased by 7.4% year-on-year, both far exceeding expectations. The trade surplus for the single month reached $90.5 billion US dollars. Among them, the 8.3% export growth rate in September was higher than economists' median forecast of 6.6%, indicating that China's record-breaking export surge is far from slowing down. The export figures also show that China's export value to the United States in September fell by a percentage compared to the same period last year. However, exports to the European Union grew by 14%. Exports to Southeast Asia increased by 15.6%, and exports to Africa surged by an even greater 56.4%. The article mentions that for many years, the United States has relied on China for the supply of household and office goods. Although China's total export volume remains huge, the decline in exports to the U.S. this year has been both broad and significant in scale. The U.S. has reduced imports of almost all Chinese goods. Take plastic products as an example. From July to October, China exported $5 billion US dollars worth of plastic products to the United States, ranging from laundry baskets to plastic forks. This represents a 16% decrease compared to the same period last year. As for furniture, last year over a quarter of China's furniture exports went to the United States, but now this proportion has dropped to nearly one-fifth. At the same time, China is exporting large quantities of cars, trucks, bicycles, and ships to developing economies such as Africa and South America. So far this year, the number of solar panels China has exported to Algeria is already close to 4 times the total for all of last year. In addition, China's market share in Europe and Asia is also expanding, mainly through the export of batteries and steel products. Matthew Mazzocco, deputy director at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, said, "What about the profit margins of China's exports to Africa? They may not be high, but for these markets, being able to access Chinese technology at affordable prices is truly transformative." The article points out that clearly other regions of the world are making up for the decline in purchases from American exporters. This year, China's shipments to other parts of the world have surged, highlighting the dominant position of Chinese manufacturing, which will not be easily weakened. China's exports are expected to reach a new historical high again this year, and such a trend. This is all thanks to China's foresight and preparation. The New York Times article points out that for many years, China has been actively seeking new customers, and large-scale investments in manufacturing have given Chinese goods a price advantage. Although U.S. President Trump lowered tariffs on China last week, the tariff levels are still at their highest in decades. The claim that these tariffs would bring jobs to America, as Trump has said, has already been questioned by many economists and manufacturing experts. Trump's efforts to suppress China, as well as the effects of re-export trade, remain unclear. D.P. Bo, deputy director of the Rhodium Group's China Research Center, said that the shift in China's exports is an ongoing process that is expected to continue and is part of a global trade transformation full of uncertainty. Trump's recent move to lower tariffs on China may help stabilize China's exports to the U.S. The article argues that although China and the U.S. have reached a truce agreement, Trump is still considering imposing restrictions on Chinese-dominated industries such as drones. By imposing external tariffs, he is attempting to free the United States from its dependence on China's key manufacturing capacity. Trump still has more than 3 years left in his term, so his efforts to reshape the trade landscape are unlikely to end here. Although the current US tariff level on China is already 25 percentage points higher than the world average, China's dominant position in manufacturing continues to support the steady flow of its exports. Michelle Lam, an economist for Greater China at Societe Generale, said that although the US has imposed tariffs on Chinese products, China's exports have remained resilient due to its diversified export markets and strong competitiveness. So far, US tariffs have had only a limited impact on China's overall trade, which may prompt China to take a tougher stance in Sino-US trade negotiations. To summarize a few key points, first, the proportion of China's direct exports to the US is now less than 10%. Trump's tariffs have undoubtedly increased pressure on China's export sector, but the impact has dropped significantly compared to the past. Second, China's exports have remained resilient, which allows China to take a tougher stance in Sino-US trade negotiations. Third, the fact that China has managed to maintain such export performance during the trade war is the result of years of preparation. As a result, China has continuously diversified its export markets, enabling it to effectively respond to the trade war initiated by Trump. In addition, on October 31st, Canadian Prime Minister Carney met with President Xi Jinping during the APEC Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in South Korea. This was the first formal meeting between the leaders of the two countries since 2017. According to AP's commentary, this signifies an important step toward repairing the fractured relationship between the two nations. After the meeting, there was a bit of good news for Canada. The Chinese government allowed travel agencies to resume organizing group tours for Chinese citizens to visit Canada. However, the issue of China's tariffs on Canadian canola products still hasn't been resolved. On November 1st, just a few hours before Carney set off to return to Canada, he said he wouldn't predict a timetable for resolving disputes like the tariffs. He explained that expecting China to immediately lower tariffs on Canadian goods such as canola was never a realistic goal to achieve right after his meeting with the Chinese side. Carney said that sometimes outsiders tend to oversimplify the issue as a straightforward trade-off, but that's not the case. That's not how it works. This meeting has already achieved its set goals. For the first time in 8 years, the highest-level bilateral relationship has been established, and some breakthrough progress has been made. When asked whether he would be willing to adjust Canada's 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles, Carney's attitude was vague. He only said that given the broad challenges facing the automotive industry, his government would act cautiously. The report said that what Carney might be referring to is the Trump administration's tariffs on Canadian automotive imports. Chris Davidson, chairman of the Canola Council of Canada, urged the Canadian government to ease trade relations with China, suggesting the removal of tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles in order to help resolve trade disputes between the two countries. Davidson said that although he is not sure whether lifting tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles would completely solve Canada's canola issue, this idea should be considered as part of the Canadian government's efforts to reach a solution with China. He said, "We first need to understand exactly what is required to solve this problem and then decide what measures to take. As for the practical goal, Canadian canola farmers really can't wait any longer." According to a Bloomberg report on November 4th, Australia will ship its first batch of 60,000 tons of canola in 5 years to China. The cargo ship loaded with the trial shipment is expected to set sail for Qingdao, China within a week. It is understood that since 2020, after then Australian Prime Minister Morrison exchanged with China, citing quarantine measures to prevent pests and diseases, requested a halt to canola imports from Australia. This is one of the first trial shipments from Australia to China since then. At least 3 batches of trial shipments have already been ordered by China, with plans to ship them in the 4th quarter of this year. After the current Prime Minister Albanese's government took office in 2022, relations with China improved and China resumed buying from Australia. A spokesperson for the Australian Department of Agriculture said that Australia is negotiating with all its trading partners, including China, to improve the conditions for agricultural product trade. The Australian Broadcasting Corporation, ABC, quoted market insiders as saying that the Australian canola market is performing strongly, with global demand increasing, which has supported domestic prices. Is production really unable to keep up? Currently, the trade dispute between Canada and China has restricted Canada's canola exports, which has already shifted demand to Australia. Bloomberg pointed out that this trial shipment of Australian canola comes at a time when trade relations between China and Canada are tense. As the world's largest canola exporter, Canada previously almost monopolized the Chinese import market. In 2024, China imported 6.3 million tons of canola, almost all of which came from Canada. However, last year, the Canadian government followed the lead of the United States and imposed a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles, as well as a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum products as a countermeasure. In response, China imposed a 75.8% anti-dumping deposit on Canadian canola this August. When China first announced these measures, some Canadian industry insiders were still holding on to a sense of luck, believing that China wouldn't be able to find alternative sources in the short term. However, in September, Reuters UK cited 3 trade sources saying that COFCO Group had already ordered at least 9 shipments of Australian canola, with each shipment being 60,000 tonnes, and plans to load the cargo between November this year and January next year. In October, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation reported that as the canola harvest season in Saskatchewan was drawing to a close, local farmers, despite a bumper crop, could not hide their anxiety. Bruton, the executive director of a non-profit organization representing canola farmers in the province, said that farmers had mixed feelings about this year's harvest. The yield this year was quite good, but many producers felt nervous every time they unloaded their canola seeds because they were worried they wouldn't be able to sell them at the best price. CFAD's the expected price. China is Saskatchewan's largest export market, and in 2024, as much as 67% of the province's canola is exported to China. Local farmers say, "I think the most important task for the federal government is to resolve these trade issues as soon as possible." In summary, Canadian politicians following the US in confronting China means that farmers have to pay the price. But they also pointed out that farmers, seeing China buying Australian canola, can only anxiously hope that the government will quickly agree to reduce the 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles. Only then can Canadian canola avoid rotting in the field.